In the past, sub-ambient cooling has been limited to exotic, enthusiast solutions like liquid nitrogen, or custom loops with chillers. But those take a lot of effort to do, can even kill your hardware if you make a mistake. So Intel decided to change that and developed this cooler together with coolermaster. This is the MasterLiquid ML360 Sub-Zero. It looks like a 360 AIO, but it has a thermoelectric cooler on the CPU cold plate that allows the CPU to go not just below ambient temperature, but also below freezing, hence the name Sub-Zero. Welcome to Dreamcore Tech. I'm Jia Cheng, and today we're going to take a look at this cooler and see how cool it really is. Coolermaster has put a thermoelectric cooler here in this huge CPU block, and we're going to get into how it works a little later. But as you can see, the thermoelectric cooler takes up so much space that the pump gets displaced into this extra little bit. If you get this for your system, you're going to need to find somewhere to mount this. Coolermaster has put a mounting bracket here with the same spacing as 120mm fans, so you can mount it to the fan mounts at the front of your case. Compatibility wise, the cooler works on any K-series Intel CPU from the 10th or 11th gen series with a Z490 or Z590 motherboard. The cooler mounting is mostly standard. There's a backplate that goes on the back, standoffs that screw onto the backplate from the front, and the CPU block mounts to that with some spring tension screws. The special thing to note is that if your motherboard has a hole in the back of the CPU socket, you will need to use the included sticky foam piece to plug that up. Why? That's actually part of what makes this cooler so interesting, and we'll get into that later. To complete the installation, just plug in your fans and pump headers to the motherboard accordingly. The remaining connections are the PCIe 8-pin power and the USB 2 header. The PCIe power is to power the thermoelectric cooler, and the USB is for the software to be able to control the thermoelectric cooler. Once you've got the system booted up, you see that the LED indicator shows red. This means that the cooler is not working correctly, in this case because the software is not yet installed. Right now, it is running just as a normal AIO cooler would, with no thermoelectric cooling in effect. To get a thermoelectric cooler working, you will need to install Intel's Cryo-cooling software. We will also be using Intel's Extreme Tuning Utility, or XTU software, to do some tweaking, so we're gonna install that as well. Links are in the description. With the Cryo-cooling software installed, it shows up here in the taskbar. Right-clicking on it brings up the menu, and you can see that the cooler is on standby mode, which means that the thermoelectric cooling is not in effect. The pump block itself also blinks blue. The second mode is the Cryo-regulated mode, which is the mode in which you are most likely to use this cooler day to day. Turning it on, we quickly see the cooler temp drop to 28 degrees Celsius, and the CPU similarly drops to around 30 degrees Celsius. Now you might be wondering, how does this work? Well, this cooler makes use of something called the thermoelectric effect, which is a process in which heat is moved using electricity. So using some electrical power, the thermoelectric cooler in here can reduce the temperature of the cold plate below ambient, and even below zero. Now you might have realized that we live in Singapore, where the relative humidity is quite high and often close to 100%. Usually with just a few degrees Celsius below ambient, you already get condensation. So why isn't that happening here? Now that's the biggest innovation by Intel and Coolermaster here, and what Intel calls intelligent sub-ambient cooling. First, they've added a seal around the CPU socket using some rubber gaskets. The foam piece on the back of the CPU socket also helps to seal off the CPU area. Second thing they did was to add sensors to the pump unit, which monitors the ambient temperature and humidity so that the cooler always knows the dew point of the surrounding air. The software then regulates the power of the thermoelectric cooler so that the cooler temperature is always a little bit higher than the dew point so that they will never get condensation. Because of this intelligent condensation control, this mode is meant to be used as an everyday mode, something you can just set and let the cooler regulate itself while you're gaming or doing work. To set this as default mode, you just need to check the Remember Cryo mode in the software. Other than the regulated mode, there is also an unregulated option here in the software. When you turn this mode on, the thermoelectric cooler goes full power, ignoring the dew point limit. You can see the temperature is very quickly dropping towards zero. Now Intel's CPU temperature sensors don't actually report anything below zero, so even though it is, we can't really see it. Only the cooler monitoring software shows the cooler is below zero. However, if you are going to use this mode, make sure you know what you're doing and take the necessary precautions. In the XTU overclocking utility, we can enable the OC-TVB mode, which allows for some extreme overclocking capabilities. In here, you can set the frequencies that the CPU will hit when temperatures are below a certain threshold. Because the CPU can run higher frequency much more stably when the temperature is low, the cryo-cooling is able to extract much higher frequencies out of the CPU. We have seen others hit 5.6 GHz on the 10900K with the same cooler. So, to conclude, the coolermaster ML360 Sub-Zero is pretty cool. For normal users, it isn't much other than bragging rights that your CPU runs at 20 degrees Celsius all the time. But for the overclocking enthusiasts, the Sub-Zero cooler is an extremely fun overclocking tool. In Intel's XTU software and with OC-TVB, you could spend days tuning the frequencies to either extremely high frequency on 2 cores or just much higher than usual frequencies on all cores for day-to-day use. So, if you have an Intel CPU and just want some fun overclocking and tweaking it, this is a great avenue for cooling. It is much easier, safer, and likely even cheaper to do than a full water cooling custom loop. And of course, it is much easier than liquid nitrogen cooling. So that's all from us here at Dreamcore Tech today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.